to welcome you to our webinar on the Food Safety Modernization Act, what the proposed rules mean for farmers and local food. This webinar is being hosted by PASA and Certified Naturally Grown and the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. And we're very pleased to share this information with you. My name is Leah Smith, and I'm the Western Region Director for PASA. And before I turn our program over to our panelists, I just want to share a couple housekeeping items for the participants in this webinar. First of all, you as attendees should all be able to listen in and view the slides as we move through the program, but you are muted. So if you think of questions, feel free to submit those by typing them into the question area in your control panel. And at the end of our presentation, I will walk through those questions out loud for our panelists to respond to. If we don't have enough time in our hour together today, we can work on following up with you by email as well. And also this webinar is being recorded, so we'll be able to share a link to that recording with you following the webinar. So with that, I'm going to turn our presentation over to our panelists.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Brian Snyder, and I'm the Executive Director of PASA, the Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agriculture, and also the Food Routes Network. The Food Routes Network runs the Buy Fresh, Buy Local program across the country, and is one of the reasons why we have more than just interest of what's happening here in Pennsylvania with these rules, but also what's happening across the country. I want to welcome all of you. It's very gratifying that we set this up for a limit of 100 people, and it did sell out. So we're very glad to have all of you involved. In addition to welcoming all PASA members to this webinar, I want to welcome the members of Certified Naturally Grown, and especially their Executive Director, Alice Veron, who I'll let talk for a minute now.
Great. Thank you, Brian. I'm really glad that we all are hosting this webinar for our members. Certified Naturally Grown has been around for 12 years now, and it was a program specifically set up for community-based farmers who are producing food without any synthetic inputs. And because of who our membership is, I knew this was a very important issue that we just had to get involved in. So we joined NSAC this year, and I really, depending on their resources and the great analysis that they've done with members like PASA to really help us support our members in getting involved in this issue and speaking out on how these rules, if left unchanged, would impact farmers throughout the country. And so I look forward to engaging with you guys further and sharing this information with our members. Brian's been involved with this issue for several years, and I thought it would be helpful for him to give us a bit of background on what has happened so far and introduce our main speakers from NSAC.
Thanks, Alice. So as Alice said, I have been involved with this Food Safety Modernization Act process for several years, in fact for almost 6 years now. Back in 2009, early 2009, when the Food Safety Modernization Act first started to move through Congress, it was actually PASA and my colleague Russell Libby at MOFGA, the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, who first went to Washington to begin speaking to members of the Commerce Committee and the House of Representatives about the bill that was just beginning to take shape at that point. And because neither Russell nor I are that good at understanding the dynamics of Washington, we immediately went to NSAC and picked up Ferd Hefner to go with us to that first meeting, and NSAC has been central ever since. We went through the legislative phase, and now we're not only just in the regulatory phase, but the regulatory phase part 2, because last year was part 1 when we worked very hard on getting tens of thousands of people to write comments. This second part is really going to be our last shot at having an effect on the rules. And so this is really the home stretch. And at this point, we have just 2 weeks to go for the comment deadline, so it's pretty critical that you all pay attention to this webinar and also share the link once it's available with others who need to know about this and to comment. We've made good progress. The FDA is listening to us. There have been a lot of conversations behind the scenes where the FDA is even helping us solve problems with farm inspections and with the definition of facility, which is something that actually initiated way back in the Bioterrorism Act of 2002. So we've got their ear. They're paying attention. They now know we exist. But there is really no question that FSMA would have greatly impacted the development of local food systems without the involvement of organizations across the country like PASA and CNG working through NSAC. NSAC has been a real champion. They've done an amazing amount of work on this issue, and it gives me great pleasure to turn this program over to two of their best, Sarah Hackney and Sophia Krajewski, who are really, you could not have any two better speakers on this topic here today. We're very lucky to have them, and I'm going to turn it over to them.
Thank you so much, Brian. This is Sarah Hackney with the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, and I'll be joined just in a second by my colleague, Sophia, here at NSAC in DC. So we're thrilled that you're all here, and really glad you're taking a little time out of what is, at least here in DC, a pretty rainy, cold day to sit inside and log onto your computer and start getting up to speed on a really critical issue for food and farms across the country. So before we get started, just a little 20-second, who the heck are we and why are we talking to you today? Brian and Alice did a great job of setting us up. But just at the big picture level, who's NSAC? NSAC is an alliance of grassroots organizations working together to advance and reform federal food and farm policy towards a more sustainable future. What does that mean in sort of real language? That means we exist here in DC to help give voice to groups like PASA and CNG and to farmers and concerned eaters around the country. We bring those voices to the policy table in DC and end up with federal policy that works better for farmers, for sustainable practices, and for the ability of both consumers and farmers to make a living and choose the food they want to eat. So as you can imagine, these new food safety rules are right up our alley, and we've been working on them for quite a while. So what are we going to talk about today? We'll try to keep it pretty brief and pretty efficient because we know you'll have questions and we want to make sure we can get to them. But I'll give you a little heads up. There's a lot of info, so please pay close attention and do write down those questions if you've got them. We'd love to take them. We'll start off with just a quick background and overview of the issues. My colleague Sophia will walk you through what are the rules, who's affected, and what are our key concerns with how they're currently written. Then we'll talk just for a second about, it should be pretty obvious, but why does this matter? Why is it important for farmers and for eaters to be engaged on FSMA? And then we'll close with a rundown of some available materials and resources that we've developed with help from members like PASA and CNG to help folks like you get involved and have an impact on the rules as they stand today. Because at the end of the day, we have a huge opportunity to improve them before they're final, before they actually affect folks. And this is our chance. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Sophia.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. And thanks to Brian and Alice for setting things up. I'm not going to spend too much time doing an overview. Brian already gave you a good amount of context about where we are today and what's going on. I am going to get into some details, but as everyone has mentioned, we'll have time for questions at the end, so bear with me. So just quickly, the overview of where we are. The Food Safety Modernization Act, FSMA, was signed into law nearly 4 years ago, and it has granted to prevent food safety problems across the supply chain. So we're talking about farmers, food processors, handlers, both domestically and internationally. Now, when this law was passed, concerns about the impacts of new regulations on small and mid-sized farms and food businesses, on sustainable and organic agriculture, on local and regional food system growth and development led to the inclusion of a number of provisions in the law that create specific considerations for many of these sectors to ensure that we end up with rules that are flexible and appropriate for all sizes and types of farms. So with that context, it brings us to where we are today. FDA is in the middle of these draft rules that they're putting out to carry out all of the requirements in the law. And we're focusing on just two, the produce safety rule and the preventive controls rule for human food. So these are rules that are focused on farmers that are growing fruits and vegetables and on food facilities that are manufacturing and processing food for humans to eat. These rules were originally proposed back in November, and based on the feedback that FDA heard from concerned farmers, consumers, organizations, they have re-proposed sections of those original proposals, not the whole rules in their entirety, but sections of these two rules for a second round of public comment. This is pretty rare for an agency to do when they're writing rules. Usually they just have one opportunity for feedback and then they finalize them, but they really grasped the importance of this issue and the importance of getting it right, so they're giving another chance for the public to weigh in before the comment period closes in under 2 weeks. So I'm going to take you quickly through both the produce rule and the preventive controls rule so that, as we talk about what's the concerns and the issues with the rules and the recommendations about how to improve them, you have the context of who's covered and what are the requirements. But I just want to point out that most of this information and much more is on our website, and Sarah's going to be talking about our resources towards the end. So if it moves quickly, just keep in mind that all this information in more detail is available on our website. So the produce rule is related to farms that are growing, harvesting, packing, and holding produce for human consumption, and it sets a range of standards related to that. These are health and hygiene standards for farmers and farm workers, training, agricultural water standards, standards related to the use of raw manure and compost, and many others. And so whether you're covered by this rule and to what extent depends on what you're growing, how big you are, who you're selling to. And so there are sort of 4 ways to think about how these rules might cover or affect you depending on those different factors. You might be exempt from the rules don't apply to you. You might be qualified exempt, which means you are subject or eligible for modified requirements. You might be fully covered by the rule but get more time to come into compliance, or you may just be covered by the rule. Farms that are exempt from the rule are those that are growing produce that is rarely consumed raw. This produce safety rule applies to produce that is usually consumed raw. Now, as a farmer, as a vegetable grower, you might be growing a mix. Maybe some of it is usually consumed raw, like tomatoes, some of it isn't, like pumpkins. So this can be sort of a moving target in some ways. But that is the intent of the rules, that it applies to produce rarely consumed raw. Or I'm sorry, produce that is usually consumed raw. Exemptions are also available for farms that are growing produce just for personal or on-farm consumption. So if this is your backyard garden, you're exempt from these rules. And then you are also exempt from the rule if you have, on average, $25,000 or less in annual sales of produce. You might be qualified exempt, so you are eligible for modified requirements under the rule if the produce that you grow is destined for commercial processing. So maybe you're just growing tomatoes, which are usually consumed raw, but they're all going to be processed into pasta sauce. So that produce would not fall under this rule, and you would be qualified exempt. You could also be qualified exempt if you fall under what's called the Tester-Hagen Amendment for direct marketing. So this applies to farms that average less than $500,000 in annual sales of all food. So not produce, but all food. Produce including anything else that you're producing for sale on your farm. And you're selling the majority, so 51% or more, direct to consumers, grocery stores, restaurants, etc., in the same state or within a 270-mile radius. If you meet both of those criteria, then the requirements that you're subject to are significantly reduced, and primarily include the requirement to provide your business information, so contact information, on a label on your product or on a sign at the point of sale. And then the final category, if you're fully covered, you may have more time to come into compliance based on the size of your farm. And so if you have less than $250,000 in produce sales annually, you get more time because you're a very small business. If you have less than $500,000 in average annual produce sales, you get more time because you're a small business. And then all other farms, if you're above that amount, then you get, as you can see here, 2 years to come into compliance, or a little bit more time for the water standard. So very quickly on the preventive controls rule, what is it and who does it affect? The preventive controls rule applies to food processing or manufacturing facilities that have to register with FDA. Now, FDA considers facilities to be those that manufacture, process, pack, or hold food for human consumption. So it's a pretty broad definition. And as you'll see as we get into this in more detail, if you fall into that definition, if you're considered what FDA considers to be a facility, then you have to register with FDA, and then the preventive controls rule applies to you. The preventive controls rule contains two parts. One is an updated section on good manufacturing practices, or GMPs, and the other is a new section that creates requirements for food facilities to create a hazard, or to follow a hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls requirement, or HART-C. And this includes a written food safety plan, hazard analysis, so you identify hazards in your operation. It requires that you implement, monitor, and verify preventive controls in the process, that you also have developed and can implement corrective actions where necessary, and that you have written records of all of this. So it's fairly extensive requirements for food facilities that have to register with FDA. Now, like the produce rule, you can think about whether or not this rule applies to you in these four categories. You might be exempt from registration. So maybe you are within FDA's definition of a food facility, but you are exempt from registration for reasons that we'll talk about in a minute. You might be subject to the rules, but you are exempt from complying with the HART-C requirements. You might be a qualified facility, which means that you're subject to modified requirements, or you could be fully covered, perhaps with extended time to come into compliance. So under the preventive controls rule, the preventive controls rule applies to you if you are a food facility that has to register with FDA. Now, farms and retail food establishments are exempt from the requirement to register. Retail food establishments are those that sell primarily markets, CSAs. All of those are considered the same as retail food establishments. They are retail food establishments. They don't have to register with FDA. So preventive controls doesn't apply. With farms, it gets a little bit tricky, and this is sort of the crux of one of the most important issues that we need comments into FDA on this rule, because as a farm, you would be exempt from registration unless you're also doing activities that FDA considers manufacturing and processing, which means you might be covered by the produce rule for the produce that you grow, but you might also be covered by the preventive controls rule because you're doing some value-added manufacturing and processing on your farm. So we'll get into that in more detail in just a moment. There are some other considerations for different kinds of businesses that do have to register as food facilities but are exempt from the HART-C requirements. This includes farms that are small or very small businesses, and they're doing low-risk processing, so making jam or maple syrup. Those are just examples of what FDA considers low-risk processing. Food that's covered by other regulations like juice or alcohol. If you are a warehouse or a grain elevator, and so all you're doing is storing packaged foods or raw agricultural products, then you would be exempt from the full HART-C requirements. Qualified facilities, if you qualify as a qualified facility, then you are subject to modified requirements, much like in the produce rule. And in the preventive controls rule, if you are what FDA considers a very small business, if you have less than $1 million in gross annual sales of human food, then you are eligible for modified requirements, which are much reduced from the full HART-C requirements. And then the fourth category of full coverage but extended compliance, again, depending on the size of your business, you have different timelines to come into compliance with the rules. So shifting focus now, I'm going to be talking about the re-proposed rules, the second round of the FSMA rules, and issues that we see as being particularly problematic for sustainable agriculture and local food. Some issues span across both rules. You'll see them come up in both the produce rule and the preventive controls rule. Some issues are specific to the produce rule, and some issues are specific to the preventive controls rule. But one of the biggest, most confusing, fundamental pieces of this whole puzzle is the farm definition. And this is something that you see appear in both rules. And so whether you fall into what FDA considers to be a farm can have great significance in terms of determining which rule applies to you. And so FDA is currently defining a farm as an establishment in one general physical location under one ownership that is devoted to growing and harvesting crops and or the raising of animals. And then within that, farms can pack and hold raw agricultural commodities. They can process them if they're going to be consuming them on farm. They can package, label, dry, or dehydrate them as long as there's no additional processing. All of those activities are considered farm activities. And if you're just doing that, then you're just a farm, and the preventive controls rule wouldn't apply to you because you wouldn't have to register with FDA as a food facility. But if you do more than this, then you are also considered a facility, and then the preventive controls rule applies. Now, in the original proposed rule, FDA had some really confusing distinctions that if you were, collecting produce from a neighboring farm to include in a CSA share, for example, they would consider you to be a facility because you were holding somebody else's produce. FDA isn't doing that anymore. They heard from concerned farmers. They heard from organizations. They know that that doesn't make sense. They took that out of the definition, and now it doesn't matter if it's your produce or your neighbor's produce. As long as you're just doing those farm activities, you're still considered a farm. You're not considered a facility. But there are still a lot of concerns with the farm definition, in large part because it's holding on to this idea of a farm that isn't really what farms look like or what farms do in reality. So this idea that farms are in one general physical location. Many of you know maybe your own farm is made up of multiple parcels that could be spread out. They could cross county lines. They could even cross state lines. The idea that farms are under one ownership, this causes confusion because there are many farm operations that might be cooperative, jointly controlled. There are other business structures that exist in farms that this definition doesn't account for. And so this results in confusion and sort of these silly results that FDA is looking at the same activity happening in two locations, an on-farm location and an off-farm location, and regulating them differently. And so our message to FDA on this is that the farm definition needs to be clear, and it needs to be accurate to what farms actually look like and what farms actually do. Otherwise, it's going to risk bringing a lot of farms under regulation as food facilities. The second issue is what we call the all-food issue. And so this issue has to do with determining whether you fall under the categories of a small or very small business, if you fall under the category of the Tester-Hagen Amendment, and if you fall under the category of the full exemption from the produce rule for $25,000 in sales. Each of these thresholds, these sales thresholds, are based on, as you can see, different calculations. Some are based on sales of produce. Some are based on all food sales. In the preventive controls rule, some is on human food, some is on all food. And so these varying thresholds can be really confusing, particularly for farms that might be covered by both rules or are called mixed type facilities by FDA. Now, FDA originally proposed these thresholds to be based on sales of all food for all of these thresholds. They made some changes in this second draft by measuring some sales based on produce sales, but there's still this all food sale in the Tester-Hagen Amendment that the concern is that it will reduce the incentive. It'll make it less likely that farms will diversify into selling fresh food, fruits, and vegetables because this threshold accounts for all food that is sold by a farm. So it's not just the produce that you're growing. If you're doing some grain or you're doing some livestock, you're doing dairy, and you decide to also start growing produce, you have to consider all of your sales when you're calculating whether or not that threshold applies to you. So the message to FDA on this is that we need to encourage farmers to continue diversifying, and we need to have clear thresholds across all of the rules that are based on what the rules actually regulate. The third issue that spans both rules is the withdrawal of a qualified exemption. So this applies to those farms that qualify as Tester-Hagen farms for direct marketers. And if you are eligible for a qualified exemption, it means that you could also lose that qualified exemption under certain circumstances. Now, in the original proposal, FDA did not provide a lot of clarity or a very fair process for when and how a farm might lose their qualified exemption. This second draft contains some significant improvements, now includes actions that FDA might take before withdrawing a qualified exemption, like sending a warning letter. And it also includes actions that FDA has to take to give the farmer notice that they're considering withdrawing the qualified exemption, and a list of things that the farmer should do, or information about what the farmer needs to do to rectify the situation, and then consider what the farmer does to improve the situation in then deciding whether or not to withdraw. It also establishes a process where if you lose your qualified exemption, you can get it back again if certain circumstances are met. So there are still some concerns about this issue, in particular that there's some consistency between the rules, that the process isn't quite the same under the produce rule or the preventive controls rule, which is confusing for farmers who might be subject to both rules. And there's also some more clarity and detail that is needed on key terms and on some timing questions. And so there's a lot more detail on that in some of the resources that we have available. So now focusing just on the produce rule, these are a few issues that are specific to produce. One of the most significant in the reproposed produce rule is the water standard. This relates both to a microbial standard for water quality and also to water testing requirements. Now, FDA's original proposal drew a lot of concern from the farming community because the standard was based on EPA's recreational water standard, not a standard developed for use in irrigation, and because it required water testing frequencies that were excessive and would have been incredibly costly. FDA received a lot of feedback on this, and they've taken a new approach, but it's still not great. They still use EPA's recreational water quality standard, but they've now included this provision that instead of the original proposal, which if you exceeded the threshold, if you were above the threshold, you had to either stop using that water or chemically treat it. Now they're allowing you to apply a rate that allows you to use that water still as long as you wait an appropriate number of days between when you finish irrigating and when you harvest the crop. And so this accounts for natural die-off in pathogens that happens due to exposure to the environment, due to sun, due to wind. And so if you exceed the threshold, you can still use that water as long as you apply the correct number of days in between irrigating and harvest. And now this just applies to, we're talking about surface water that's used in a direct application method. So we're not talking about drip irrigation, for example. These requirements apply only if you're using your water, untreated surface water, for direct application to the harvestable portion of a crop. The second part of this agricultural water standard is the testing frequencies. And FDA's new proposal modifies the testing frequencies, and so it slightly reduces the overall number of tests that are required, but it's still pretty excessive. It now requires that you establish a baseline survey of your water, of each water source, so that you can develop an understanding of your water quality profile. And this requires that you take at least 20 samples over at least 20 years initially to establish your baseline for surface water, for untreated surface water. And then every year after that, you take 5 samples annually to verify that your baseline is still accurate. For groundwater, it's 4 samples over 1 year to establish your baseline, and then 1 sample annually. And so, you know, the message to FDA on this is just that the water standard is still inappropriate. It should be an irrigation standard, and it's FDA's duty to you know, go after the science and establish a standard that works for farmers. And that, in the meantime, the testing frequencies are still too burdensome. They're really inflexible. Overall, FDA is sort of micromanaging the approach to water testing, and that it would make far more sense to align testing frequency requirements with rules that are already out there, or structures, schemes that are already out there, like what already exists for USDA Good Agricultural Practices, or USDA GAPS, which requires 3 samples per growing season. Second issue in the produce rule is the use of biological soil amendments of animal origins. We're talking about raw manure and composted manure. Originally in the proposal, the FDA proposed an interval for when you can apply raw manure or composted manure to your fields, and then when you can harvest from those fields. And those intervals conflicted with existing National Organic Program standards and would have seriously disrupted the ability of sustainable and organic farmers to use manure and compost on their farms. FDA heard back significantly from the sustainable and organic agriculture communities, and as a result has significantly revised their approach on this issue. They've now changed the composting standard so that it aligns with the National Organic Program. As long as you're using approved composting processes, there's no interval between when you can apply the compost and when you can harvest. And on raw manure, they realized that they need more science on this issue, that the science just wasn't there to support the interval that they were proposing, and so they're going to wait. They're not going to propose an interval now. They're going to undertake a research and risk assessment agenda working with USDA and with stakeholders to come up with the information that they need to propose a new standard, which would then be open for public comment before they finalize the raw manure standard. So that means that organic farmers that are still using the National Organic Program would continue to follow that standard in the interim. Another issue is on natural resources conservation and wildlife habitat protection. The original proposed rule created a lot of concern that the requirements would undermine existing on-farm conservation, that we've seen in other foodborne illness outbreaks that prompted the unintended consequence of having farmers undo conservation that was already on their farm, so ripping up buffer strips or other practices that support beneficial wildlife habitat, like pollinators. And so FDA in the revised rule has now included a provision that says this rule does not require farmers to harm endangered species, destroy habitat, or clear farm borders to try to clear up that confusion. We still think that this is a good provision. This clears things up, but that FDA could still do more on this to ensure that conservation isn't undermined as a result of these rules. And in parts of the rule, not in the regulatory language itself, but FDA has said, we encourage farmers that are using sustainable conservation practices. We think co-management is a good thing. And so our message to FDA is that that needs to be in the rules too, so that we're sure that these practices are still supported. So switching gears a little, out of the produce rule, now we're into the preventive controls rule. I talked about 3 issues already that are in the preventive controls rule and the produce rule: the farm definition, the all food issue as it relates to the very small business definition, and the withdrawal of a qualified exemption. Last 3 issues I'm going to touch on quickly before turning it over to Sarah is the supplier verification, product testing, and environmental monitoring, and the retail food establishment issue. So the supplier verification is a new concern in this draft rule. In the original proposed rule, FDA didn't include this requirement for food facilities. This is a requirement that manufacturing and processing facilities get on-site audits of their suppliers who are supplying them with raw materials or ingredients that pose significant adverse health consequences. Now, if you're just listening to that and you're hearing me say significant adverse health consequences, well, what do you mean by that? And that's the question. It's not entirely clear what FDA means by that. And so we're left to assume that that means probably any produce that you're supplying to a manufacturing or processing facility, which could be a food hub, that's usually consumed raw. So if you're a farmer and you're supplying carrots to a food hub that's then chopping them and peeling them and sending them off to a cafeteria at a school, then it's very possible that this supplier verification audit requirement would apply to you. Now the problem with that is that when Congress passed FSMA, they specifically said FDA cannot require audits to verify compliance because they knew that it would cost a significant amount to the different parties that, the farms or the food businesses that would be covered by these rules. And so FSMA said that FDA couldn't require audits, and yet here's this audit requirement in the rule. And the concern is that it could subject particularly produce farms to duplicative, costly, burdensome audit requirements. And so the message to FDA on this is that Congress said you can't require audits. They're going to be expensive and burdensome for farmers that are covered by multiple rules already, and you need to take this out of the rule. The second issue is on environmental monitoring and product testing, and this again relates back to costs of compliance. These are provisions that weren't included in the original proposal, and FDA has now put them into the regulations that require food facilities to have product testing and environmental monitoring in place. So this means taking samples of product, either when you're receiving from your supplier or potentially finished product testing on its way out the door, as well as environmental monitoring, taking samples of work surfaces, et cetera, and testing for pathogens. FDA has estimated that this is going to greatly increase costs, disproportionately so for the smallest businesses, those with less than 20 employees. And we're talking about, an extra $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 a year, depending on the size of your operation, depending on how many different suppliers you're bringing in ingredients from, depending on how many different products you have going out the door. And our message to FDA is that these might be important verification measures for some operations, but that to be truly flexible and to not, disproportionately burden small businesses, these shouldn't be in the rules. These types of provisions should be in guidance. The final issue is the retail food establishment definition. When Congress passed FSMA, they told FDA to clarify in the rules that farmers markets, CSAs, and other direct marketing platforms are not facilities, and so they don't have to register with FDA, and the preventive controls rule does not apply to them. The issue is that FDA still hasn't done this. They've hinted at it. They've said they're going to put out a new rule that clears this up, but they haven't actually done it yet. And until they do, we can't fully understand the impacts of these rules on local foods. And so the message here is that FDA needs to get this clarification out and available for public comment so that we can get a full sense of the way that these rules are going to impact sustainable ag and local food. And so with that, I'm sure that was more than you wanted to know, but we'll have plenty of time for questions, and I'm going to pass it over to Sarah to talk about available resources and other commenting information.
All right. Thanks a lot, Sophia. Thanks, folks, for hanging with us and working your way through. Whew, a lot of information, huh? Whew. All right. So if you're like me, you're thinking, wow, that's a lot going on. I see why this is a big issue. So for some of those folks who like to think about it at a big picture, I'm just going to take a second to maybe step us back to about 30,000 feet before we dive back into resources. And that's, you listened to Sophia give you a lot of details about some of the core issues with the rules. And what you see on your screen now is sort of more the big picture view. And at the end of the day, what we're really trying to do here is make sure that these new rules, which have been passed by Congress, which are on their way to becoming law, actually work for farmers and work for the kind of food and farm system that we want to see for our country. And what we're asking FDA to do is really at its core, let farms be farms. And that means, letting innovations around getting local and regional food to the people who need it, letting those thrive and not having these rules unintentionally stifle their growth. That means, allowing and encouraging farms to work with nature and to grow sustainably. And then finally, and a really, really critical way, it means, that making sure that farmers are treated fairly with the process. That, a small family farmer is not expected to meet or deal with the same level of expense as a large multi-million-dollar operation, and that in all cases things are fair, clear, transparent for everybody involved. That's just to kind of help you get sort of at that very big picture level, what are we trying to ask for? So let's shift gears for a second and talk about how are we going to get there. So we've just walked through all the issues and what we think will work better and what's going on at the big picture. Let's talk for a second about how we're going to get there and make sure that we have an impact on the final process, the final rules. So as you can tell, undeniably going to have a big impact on what goes on. The good news is it's a really effective tool that every single person on this call and every single person who is remotely interested in this issue has in their toolbox, and that is when a federal agency like the FDA proposes new rules, they're required by law to seek public comment, to seek public input on the rules before the final. They're also required to read every single one that gets submitted. So every single one of you has the opportunity to submit a comment to FDA with your thoughts about the rules. Now, if you're a farmer, that could be your thoughts around, here's how this is, here's why I'm concerned. Here is why I'm concerned this is going to impact my business. If you're an eater, you could say,
I want to be able to choose the food I want for my family. There's a lot of different ways that you can frame it, and everyone gets a chance to do that. The reason, as Brian and Sophia both said, the reason that these rules are better than they were last year is because over 20,000 folks took the time to comment last year, and FDA took those comments into consideration when they did this draft too. Just like, imagine if anybody has, high school kids or college students on the phone, just like if you're working with your kid or your friends or you're writing your own college paper, the first draft is never quite right. You always got to do some edits. You got to do some revisions. Rules are just like a college paper. They require a few drafts. This is our chance to weigh in on that draft before it's final. So how do I do that? What's going on? The good news is it's free. It's easy. It is not considered lobbying for any institutional folks on the call. Everyone can and should do it. And you can comment either online or via regular old postal mail. And so when I say comment, I'm not for the most part talking about, say, a petition or a sign-on letter, but a chance for you on this call, on this webinar, to open up your word processor or your pen and paper, write down your comments, write down your thoughts, and submit them either through an online form or via the mail. And I'll talk in a minute about some resources we have to help you do that. Here's another thing you might be thinking. Well, I'm not an expert. This is a lot of information, and I'm unsure about whether this is a big deal for my business or how I could possibly have an impact. If you've been listening and you found it confusing and you're a farmer, that doubly means you should comment. It's really important that FDA hears from folks who say, I'm making my best effort to understand it and it's still confusing. That's a problem with proposed rules. So anyway, that's okay. It means you should comment anyway. It's okay to say, I'm confused about this and you guys need to clarify. And what should I say? And again, I'll talk more about resources in a second, but at the very big picture level, just like people, even folks at agencies, they respond the same way we do. Stories are effective. If you're a farmer and you can say, this is what I do, I'm a farmer, I grow this kind of food, and here's where I sell it. You don't have to get into total details if you're not comfortable sharing everything online. That's okay. You can also not make it public. But anyway, we'll get to that second. Anyway, you can say, this is what I do, this is why it's safe, this is why it's important that these rules not force me, say, to test my water this many times a year. So your story, your narrative, is the most powerful thing that you can share. Here's also one thing. If you take one very important piece of information away, this one's very big, it's very important. The comment period is only open for 2 more weeks. When that deadline comes, our window is closed, and we may not get another chance to see these rules for months and months. So if you're going to do it, now is the time. Go ahead and start thinking about it, preparing something, and note that deadline is December 15th. That means postmarked in the mail or submitted online before midnight. All right, let's talk about resources really quickly. You see that link at the top? This is your one-stop shop for everything you need. On this NSAC's FSMA Action Center. On that, you're going to find tools to help you get informed, an overview of everything Sophia just covered, Am I Affected guidance for farmers and food businesses, and issue basics. You're going to find comment templates and instructions. This is what I talked about for resources. I know it's kind of scary to stare at a blank page of paper and think, well, what in the world am I supposed to say? Our templates are designed to help you do that effectively. They've got all the fancy numbers for the docket. They've got all the technical things to make it easy for you. They've got questions you can answer to help make sure your comment is effective in reaching FDA. And finally, just putting that plug there, everything on that website is shareable. You can share it with anyone you know who's also concerned about food and farms and who ought to be able to comment. Just see, and here's a little visual for the visual folks. When you click on that link, this is what you'll see. You look over there to the left on the sidebar, and there you can see overview, who's affected, issues, and everything you need. One more thing I want to flag for any farmers or producers, food businesses on the call. We also produced a farmer and food business flowchart. This is free, and again, download it, use it, share it. It's intended to help you walk through whether or not you may be affected, aka subject to either of the proposed rules. Now, it's not legally binding. One of us is a lawyer, but we don't have any legal standing on this one. This is our effort to help you understand
And again, the rules aren't final. Things could change. But if you're confused and you're not sure, this flowchart tool will help you get some clarity. Last piece, when you say, okay, I'm ready to comment, you're going to go to that action center. When you say, speak out today and you follow those instructions, just again for you visual folks, this is what you're going to see. You're going to see this comment page. And you'll see that little line at the bottom. It says, are you a farmer? Are you a consumer? There are separate templates for farmers and consumers. That's because we expect farmers may have a little more info to share. They may also be willing to spend a little bit of time because it's their livelihood and their business at stake. Your template is a little longer, a little more detailed. It's designed for you as a farmer or food business. If you're a consumer, it's shorter, it's simpler. It's a great one for CSA customers, people at the farmer's market. It's only one page. It's a lot faster if you're a consumer. So just so you know, those are both free, available to you. When you click on that link, this is where you'll go. To wrap that up and shift us over to question time, just a couple of take-home notes. If you take anything away from today, it's that every single person on this call has an opportunity and an obligation, if you care about sustainable food and farms, to submit a comment before that December 15th deadline. We welcome and encourage everyone who's able and willing to help spread the word. PASA and C&G are already doing quite a lot, and we're very grateful for that. Look, if you don't already follow all three of us on Facebook or Twitter, we're posting about it. You can easily, 2 clicks, you can share it and help make sure that others have a chance to get informed and get engaged too. And with that, I'm just going to close here with a couple of reminders so that we can switch the questions. There's that deadline. Please don't forget it. There's your 2 links. You can get to everything from that top one. And there, for questions or follow-up, are contact info for all of us. And with that, I will hand it back over to our organizers.
Okay, great. We do have a few questions already in during the presentation, and if other questions come to mind, feel free to type those into your question panel, and I'll just work through them now with our panelists. The first question came earlier in the presentation from Zach Borber, wondering, is the HARPC, is that the same as a HACCP?
Good question for Sophia. Yep. So they are very similar, but they are not identical. But they're sort of modeled after HACCP. Yeah. So if you're already familiar with HACCP and are already using HACCP or have a HACCP plan, then HARPC, the HARPC requirement probably won't be that big or that scary for you because they are very similar.
Okay, great. Our next question from David Juicy is, does the direct sales exemption, Hester-Hagen, apply to wholesale sales to another CSA, which then sells to customers or to restaurants within the distance limits? Essentially, what counts as a consumer or a retail food establishment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the way that the Hester-Hagen amendment plays out is that at least, over half of your sales, so we're saying 51% or more, have to be to a qualified end user. And so FDA defines qualified end user as a consumer or a retail food establishment, which includes things like grocery stores and restaurants. Now, I believe that a CSA would then be part of that definition also, given the retail food establishment issue that I brought up during the presentation. So FDA is supposed to be clarifying that CSAs fall within that retail food establishment definition. And so once FDA makes that change, then I think we could say with more certainty that yes, CSAs, if you're selling to a CSA, that's a qualified end user. So I think that that's an example of a really important comment to make to FDA, that if I'm selling to CSAs, does that count as a qualified end user? We still don't know what a retail food establishment, how it's going to be defined. This is an area that needs to be cleared up so I know how to calculate my sales to determine if I qualify for the exemption under Hester-Hagen.
Sophia, I'd like to add that this is also an area that overlaps with the issue related to the farm definition. And one of the reasons why we're trying to make sure that cooperative ownership models and even just the practice of farms working together in order to fill CSA baskets is protected as a farm activity, and why it's very important, because it may be that if Tester Hagen is not your main concern may be just not wanting to be defined as a facility, because that may cause more problems for you than if you don't meet the Tester Hagen requirements.
Okay, great. David had one other question. How is the post-irrigation waiting period calculated? How do I know what that is? This could be a big deal or not at all.
Right, that's a really good question. So FDA has provided a rate of, it's called the microbial die-off rate. So they provide a rate that you can use when you are calculating how many days you need to wait between irrigating and harvesting. And the rate that they provide is a 0.5 log reduction per day. And so FDA has said that they will be putting out materials like formula sheets to help calculate, how many days that means if you're applying that rate. But essentially what that means is that every day after you irrigate, you can assume that roughly 67% of the pathogen or the generic E. coli, at least on the surface of the crop, has been reduced due to natural causes. And so every day it's an additional 67% reduction. That's what the 0.5 log per day rate means. So if you're above the microbial standard, then you can apply, so many days between irrigating and harvest to get down below the standard. And so, it's a little complicated figuring out how to calculate that. FDA also says that if you have, science or other information to back up a different rate, then you could apply a different rate, but that they're providing the 0.5 rate as sort of a universally accepted rate.
And I wanted to point out that while we're talking about water, that that it's not just irrigation water that's at issue here, but for those of you who may spray, whether with synthetics or organically approved materials directly to fruit and vegetables, that spray water is also at issue here. So don't forget about that.
Okay, we have a question from Chris Arnold. Does the exemption for small farmers mean that they are exempt from the new rules, or that you have an extended time to get in line with these rules?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it depends on which exemption we're talking about. So there's really just one outright, total exemption from the rules for farmers under the produce rule, and that's the $25,000 sales exemption. So if you have less than or equal to $25,000 in produce sales every year, averaged over the past 3 years, then you would be exempt from the rules completely. The other categories, the qualified exemption under Tester Hagen, or the very small business and small business definitions, those just change your responsibilities under the rule, either by modifying the requirements that you have to follow or giving you more time to come into compliance with the requirements, but you are not exempt from the rules. So it depends on your size.
Okay. Sam Wise is wondering how many foodborne illnesses have actually come from small farmers at farmers markets, from both produce and prepared foods, for this to actually be an issue for the FDA to worry about?
Oh, I wish that I had, specific numbers to give you on that. From what I understand, the actual data that FDA has on foodborne illnesses isn't the full picture of what's happening out there. It's rather incomplete. And so we don't really have a good idea of it, but it's certainly not something that has risen to the level of the other foodborne illness outbreaks that we have seen. And so I think FDA is aware that different types of supply chains pose different risks and is trying to consider that in putting out these rules.
But
Brian,
that point,
perhaps you want to add something?
that point is exactly a very good one to put into your comments, just to even add a little flavor at the beginning or end. It's not a technical point that will necessarily support your comments, but I think the more times the FDA hears that comment, the more inclined they are to actually support all of the proposals that NSAC and other organizations are making. You won't be surprised to know that same question has come up about 1,000 times in the comment process. It's something that is always on the tip of people's tongues. It's like, why are we even talking about this? The fact is that all of us are interested in producing safe food. Nobody wants anybody to get sick. And as long as it's fair, as long as it's something that is reasonable for people to be doing, I think, we all want to know what we can do to make sure that the food is safe. But there's no question that the food safety outbreaks that have been publicized nationally have come from very large operations, usually involving long distances of shipping and many hands handling through the process. And that's really what we're aiming to get at in this process.
Okay, we have one more question right now. Couple coming in. We have a question from Joe Bazzelli. Is there a planned threshold on the cost that a farm will be burdened with when doing this water testing, especially for the baseline? My groundwater testing costs right now are $1,000 per test because of all the fracking going on around me. That would equate to $4,000 for the initial year, which is not possible.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really good question and an incredibly important issue to raise here and also in your comments. FDA hasn't provided an updated assessment of what this new proposed testing scheme would cost. They tend to think that tests cost more like $50 to possibly $100 per test. And so if that is not true for you, then that's something that FDA needs to hear. They don't know necessarily what it's like in different parts of the country, especially accessing labs and how much it costs to get the test results. And so your specific situation, whether it's at the $1,000 range or somewhere below or above, it's incredibly important to be able to provide that information to FDA when making the point that they need to reconsider this whole testing frequency and find serious ways to significantly reduce the number of tests that they require, particularly in cases like this where the water quality might be something that is totally outside of your control. And so I would encourage you to include that in comments to the FDA.
Great. We have another question with our last few minutes here. What is the average cost to be HARP-C certified?
That is a good question, and I don't have that number at the top of my head. The cost of compliance vary based on the complexity of your particular operation, but FDA has provided some initial estimates of what they expect costs to be. I unfortunately don't have that in front of me right now, but I can assure you that we have information on our website about the costs associated with the different rules in the Learn About the Issues section. And so if you go into those, there are specific sections on costs to facilities and consumers. And actually,
if that question was specifically about the cost of certification, that might be related to GAP certification. And
right.
we should make clear that this is not yet the same thing as GAP certification, although there will be an effort to bring the USDA process and the FDA process together in the future.
And I should just add, I pulled this up quickly. So if you are subject to the full requirements of the Preventive Controls Rule, the full HARP-C requirements, FDA has estimated that it will cost you about $13,000 annually. and that's without the cost of the new provisions in the supplier verification program requirements and in the environmental monitoring and product testing. If you are a qualified facility, it's more like anywhere between $500 and $2,000. If you are exempt from HARP-C, then costs of compliance are further still below that, but we are talking about significant costs.
Okay, and just to clarify this, Jamie Moore asked that question, and he had just one follow-up. Do you need to hire someone to write your HARP-C plan?
So in FSMA, when Congress passed it, they said that the rules can't require you to have to get a third party or someone else to write your plan. So the rules don't require that of you, but the rules are certainly written in a way that it would be likely helpful to have someone else help you write that plan, whether it's, ideally there might be folks at Cooperative Extension who might be able to help you, folks at PASA, once the rules are finalized and we have a clearer idea of what the full requirements are. But the rules don't require you to have somebody else write your plan, though the plan needs to be written by someone who is knowledgeable on the subject, has maybe had some training on it, et cetera.
Okay. Well, we are just at 2:30 now, and I think that's the conclusion of our questions from those attending today. And I will just take a moment to thank our panelists and remind those listening in to feel free to reach out to any of them with any follow-up questions that you may have related to submitting your comments. Do you have any last words as we conclude things?
Yeah, I want to just say thank you to everybody. Thank you to Sophia and Sarah from NSAC. Thank you to Alice and her organization, Certified Naturally Grown, for participating. And thank you to Leah Smith for actually doing all of the work behind the scenes to make sure this webinar happened. I found it very informative for myself even. It's always good to hear it again. And I hope everybody benefited. But I can't emphasize enough, go to the NSAC site, look through the materials there, use their templates, and comment by the comment deadline. It's critical that your voice be heard now so that you don't regret it later, that you didn't make some point that you could have. So I want to thank everybody for participating, and I look forward to hearing some of your comments personally, perhaps, in the future about what you wrote to FDA and how it may have affected the outcome.
Great. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.